It's a quiet afternoon in the rolling hills of the American West. The sun, golden and comforting, dips low on the horizon, casting long shadows across an old movie ranch. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear the distant echo of boots thudding across dusty ground, the ring of spurs, and the creak of leather saddles, like a distant memory of a bygone era. This tranquil setting was once the domain of actors who defined an entire generation's love affair with the Western. A love for tumbleweeds, wide skies, and a solitary hero riding off into the sunset. One name, however, glimmers like an undiscovered gem to some and a nostalgic memory to others: James Drury. For nearly a decade, he was known simply as the Virginian, the rugged, taciturn cowboy with unshakable moral resolve. Yet behind the scenes and long after the show ended, James Drury lived a life filled with remarkable twists and lesser-known milestones. Today we'll take a deep dive into the journey of the man who wore the cowboy hat so naturally it felt like it had been his birthright. This is the story of James Drury, his history, his untold struggles, his controversies, and the enduring legacy he left behind. Growing up in the 1930s and 1940s, James Drury was born into a world where radio was still king, movies were shot on film that was black and white, and Hollywood was transitioning into one of its golden eras. Raised primarily in New York City, he was the child of a marketing executive father and a mother who had strong cultural roots in Ireland, bringing with her a love of storytelling. That early environment, mixing urban hustle with bits of old-world charm, profoundly shaped young James. His father was busy much of the time, but whenever possible he introduced James to the magic of performance, visiting film sets or stage productions, where business and art intersected. From an early age, James was not only aware of the possibility of show business, he was fascinated by the sheer variety of personalities, costumes, and scripts that flew by him like so many glimpses into alternate realities. These fleeting encounters planted a seed that would grow into a passion. Yet if you assume his path was free of adversity, you'd be mistaken. As a child, James Drury faced a serious health challenge. He contracted polio at the age of 10. Polio in those days was a dreaded disease that could leave children with debilitating mobility issues and long-term disabilities. At first, doctors weren't optimistic about his recovery, warning his parents that physical struggles could accompany him for life. Yet James displayed a determination and grit that foreshadowed his future as a rugged cowboy hero. With the support of a loving family and a relentless spirit, he fought through treatments, gradually regained his strength, and, after considerable effort, returned to a somewhat normal childhood. This period of vulnerability revealed something profound about James. Behind his stoic demeanor lay an internal fire that refused to be snuffed out by adversity. Life in New York wasn't all darkness for him. When he was around 8, he found himself enchanted by the stage. He took part in small theatrical plays, local recitals, and school productions. Looking back, some of his peers would recall how focused he seemed, even as a child. He wanted to do more than play pretend. He wanted to embody each role, get lost in every script. This intense commitment was unusual for someone so young, yet it became James's hallmark. That seriousness about acting propelled him to take formal acting classes in his teenage years. While many kids his age were thinking about sports teams or dreaming of typical teenage rites of passage, James was learning the craft of performance, absorbing technique and discipline from seasoned teachers who recognized that spark of genuine talent. In the post-war period of the late 1940s, America was finding its stride. Hollywood was bustling with productions that captured the country's changing identity. Westerns, in particular, had become a staple of the American imagination. They presented a world where moral lines were clearly drawn, where stoic heroes maintained an unspoken code of honor. By the time James was a teenager, Western serials on television and Western movies on the silver screen were proliferating, inspiring thousands of boys to don toy six-shooters and daydream of corralling cattle beneath a big sky. The Western genre forged an unbreakable link between American identity and the open frontier. From a distance, James Drury was taking it all in. He had no idea that these cinematic worlds of dusty trails and fading sunsets would one day become his personal domain. Eventually, James's father was relocated in the mid-1950s, giving James the opportunity to spend more time on the West Coast. The sunlit boulevards and palm trees of Los Angeles were a far cry from the busy streets of New York. Yet in those early days, LA wasn't just a city, it was an idea. Hollywood was near its zenith, brimming with a heady cocktail of ambition, star power, and big dreams. Studio gates seemed almost mythical, promising untold possibilities if only you could walk through them. At this point, James enrolled briefly in New York University for drama, but he soon discovered that the real classroom he wanted was out west, in proximity to the epicenter of filmmaking. He followed the siren call of Hollywood and began chasing roles, determined to make a name for himself. Breaking into the industry was challenging even then. With so many fresh faces arriving each day hoping for their big break, the competition was fierce. Yet James was equipped with that stoic determination. He started knocking on studio doors, attending casting calls, and using every networking opportunity available. His first small roles arrived in the mid-1950s. Among them were appearances in productions such as Forbidden Planet, 1956, though not in starring roles. He would also pop up in small television parts, including anthology series and crime dramas that were popular at the time. While these appearances were minor, they slowly built his portfolio and gave him an invaluable education in front of the camera. If you watch some of his earliest roles, you might notice a reserved, intense presence, a quiet magnetism that future casting directors would later see was well suited for Western heroes. It wasn't just the allure of the camera that kept James going. His earliest exposure to ranch life and rural America had lit a fascination with the West's vast landscapes. Although he'd grown up in a major city, something about the wide open spaces, the authenticity of rural characters, and the tangible honesty of manual labor drew him in. He spent time visiting friends who owned ranches, soaking up the rhythms of daily life, waking up before sunrise, tending to animals, and living by the mercy of weather conditions that changed the day's work in an instant. These experiences left a deep impression on James. Years later, it's apparent that part of his easy, natural portrayal of cowboys sprang from first-hand contact with Western culture. He understood the quiet pride that came with living close to the land. Like many aspiring actors of his era, James Drury started snagging guest spots in well-known TV westerns. Shows like Gunsmoke, Cheyenne, and Death Valley Days were popular, and producers often scouted for fresh faces to play villainous outlaws or town deputies. Casting directors noticed something in Drury's demeanor. He didn't need to overact, wave his arms, or grit his teeth comically to portray toughness. He had a measured intensity that left viewers leaning in, wanting to see what would happen next. One memorable early performance was in Gunsmoke, where he played a morally conflicted character. Though it was a supporting role, James treated it with all the emotional depth he could muster. Fellow cast members later recalled how he asked pointed questions about the character's backstory, wanting to ground his performance in something beyond the scripted lines. It was that extra effort that made people notice. By the early 1960s, Westerns had become some of the highest-rated shows in America. Despite new genres vying for attention, like the budding spy thrillers and soap operas, Westerns remained a cultural giant. This was the climate that saw the birth of The Virginian, a sweeping, ambitious adaptation of Owen Wister's 1902 novel. The production was notable even before it aired. It was among the few Western TV series to run 90-minute episodes, an unusual format that allowed for more expansive storytelling. Producers wanted a lead actor who could carry the weight of that extended runtime and keep the audience enthralled. They needed someone who could exude a rugged, contemplative nature. They found exactly that in James Drury. Securing the role of the Virginian in 1962 was no small feat. There were established actors also auditioning, and some producers worried that James was still relatively unproven as a leading man. But Drury's audition was quietly electric. He seemed to understand the titular character on a deeper level, the man with no known name, a loner's spirit, yet fiercely loyal to the Shiloh Ranch and its owner. Executive producer Roy Huggins recognized that James had a rare capacity to disappear into the role. When production began, James seized the opportunity, showing up early to learn the ranch chores, practice horseback riding until it felt second nature, and develop an easy chemistry with the supporting cast. Some folks behind the scenes joked that they didn't know where James ended and The Virginian began. Once The Virginian premiered, audiences immediately took to James's stoic cowboy. The show blended traditional Western motifs, gunfights, cattle drives, and frontier conflicts, with a unique focus on moral dilemmas. Each episode was almost a mini-movie, with story arcs that delved into ethical choices, personal loyalties, and frontier justice. Over the next 9 seasons, 1962 to 1971, the show became a fixture in American households. In fact, The Virginian holds a special place as one of the longest-running Westerns in TV history, rivaled only by a handful like Gunsmoke. While it never quite reached the massive cultural peak of some other shows, it maintained a loyal fan base that remained captivated by Drury's unflinching sense of justice and calm leadership. The role forever fused James Drury's identity with that of the Virginian. Children dressed up in cowboy hats and mimicked his slow, thoughtful line delivery. Parents appreciated that he presented a moral compass, not a flamboyant hero, but a quiet one who took his responsibilities and friendships seriously. Behind the camera, James was similarly respected. Crew members praised his work ethic, noticing how he insisted on doing many of his own stunts when possible. He'd be up before dawn to ride the horses and get a feel for the day's shoot. Sometimes he'd help wrangle animals, or set up a scene if it was behind schedule. "We're in this together," he'd often say to the crew. That team spirit was reciprocated, creating a tight-knit environment. Co-stars Doug McClure, Lee J. Cobb, and others became more than just castmates. They forged long-lasting friendships. Yet stardom in Hollywood rarely comes without emotional costs or challenges. During his time on The Virginian, James Drury found that the demands of a long-running series tested not only his endurance but also his personal life. Filming 9 months of the year, often 6 days a week, placed a severe strain on his family relationships. He had been married and divorced more than once, a fact that reflected the intense pressure of show business. His second marriage to Phyllis Mitchell produced children, but balancing fatherhood with the grueling work schedule proved tough. He tried to bring his family on set, or at least keep them involved in the show's environment. Still, the consistent travel and on-location shoots in places like Lone Pine, California, created distance that was sometimes impossible to bridge. In later interviews, James openly admitted that the show's success came at a price, one that often weighed heavily on him. Despite these personal sacrifices, James Drury was fiercely proud of his role. One rarely discussed anecdote from the filming stands out. Around the 5th season, producers wanted to incorporate a storyline where the Virginian would be framed for a crime, locked up, and forced to prove his innocence. It was a departure from the usual formula, potentially showcasing the character's vulnerability more than ever before. James threw himself into the script. He asked for rewrites that dug deeper into the Virginian's emotional landscape, highlighting his sense of betrayal and righteous anger. During an especially tense scene where his character breaks out of jail, James insisted on doing a physically demanding stunt. It required him to leap from a galloping horse onto a moving wagon. Stunt doubles were present, but James felt strongly that the authenticity of the Virginian lay in the audience seeing his own face during critical stunts. Although he sustained minor bruises, the scene was shot with him in action, and it became one of the most talked about sequences that season. Off-screen, James also dealt with industry politics. There were quiet discussions about the show's structure, whether it should remain 90 minutes or be trimmed to a standard hour. Budget concerns cropped up, and network executives occasionally worried about script pacing. James lobbied passionately to preserve the extended format, believing it was integral to what made the Virginian stand out. He was vocal about wanting complex story arcs, greater depth, and more nuanced characters. Though he wasn't the showrunner, his voice carried weight due to the show's success and his unwavering dedication. In the end, the 90-minute format remained intact until the final season, though changes in direction and cast left the series less stable toward its later years. By 1971, after 9 seasons, The Virginian concluded. Television was rapidly evolving, with new genres and cultural sensibilities taking hold. Audiences were shifting their attention to sitcoms, variety shows, and gritty crime dramas. The Western, once dominant, began a slow decline. For James Drury, the end of The Virginian meant stepping away from a role that had defined his public identity for nearly a decade. Some fans wondered if he could successfully transition to other genres, or if he'd forever be typecast as that silent cowboy figure. Reflecting on this period, James once said in an interview that the industry could be quite unforgiving. A role that grants you fame can also become a cage, limiting your opportunities to break new ground. Still, James Drury wasn't ready to ride off into the sunset. He continued to pursue acting, taking guest roles on series like Alias Smith and Jones, and even dabbling in feature films. However, none of these parts achieved the cultural resonance that The Virginian had. During the 1970s and into the 1980s, he also found himself returning to his old love for the ranching lifestyle, sometimes appearing at rodeos or Western conventions. He provided commentary and occasionally gave riding demonstrations, delighting fans who cherished a piece of living Western lore. With the decline of traditional Westerns, his TV roles became less frequent. Yet he never lost that sense of connection with the West, often reminding people that the cowboy way of life was about more than the aesthetics of hats and boots. It was about character, honesty, and a willingness to stand up for what's right. Around this time, James drifted into other ventures, including business. He invested in real estate, particularly in rural properties, in places like Oregon, drawn to the wide open spaces that reminded him of the spirit he'd portrayed on television. This was also a period of personal reflection. Having experienced multiple marriages, he sought a quieter life, yearning for stability and contentment. He remarried, finding a partner who supported not only the man he had become, but the complicated figure behind the cowboy image, someone who had worked tirelessly, wrestled with the weight of celebrity, and was now looking to shape a life beyond the glare of Hollywood spotlights. He did face controversies, though they weren't as public as some might assume. One involved disputes over royalties for The Virginian. The series enjoyed reruns and syndication, but contracts from the 1960s often did not account for the longevity and global reach that television shows enjoy today. James Drury felt that he and other cast members were not fairly compensated for these subsequent airings. While he never pursued a high-profile lawsuit, the tension generated quiet discontent behind the scenes and fueled broader conversations about how actors, especially from older series, deserve fair residuals. Another point of contention was the portrayal of Native Americans in some episodes. In retrospect, James acknowledged that certain plots were shaped by the attitudes of the era. Though not personally responsible for writing them, he later expressed empathy for how stereotypes played out on the show and believed that modern Western productions should strive for more accurate and respectful representations. As time passed, the legend of the Virginian continued to attract new fans through reruns and nostalgic revivals. In fan conventions celebrating old Westerns, James Drury stood out as an authentic piece of living history. He was invited to countless events where he'd greet longtime admirers, people who grew up with the show, and younger viewers discovering it for the first time. He relished these interactions, sharing behind-the-scenes anecdotes about how they filmed chase scenes, revealing comedic pranks that he and Doug McClure played on set, or recounting how at times the desert heat was so intense you could fry an egg on the wagon's metal rim. Many fans were impressed by how approachable and humble he remained, given his iconic status in Western lore. One particularly poignant story emerged from these fan gatherings. A woman well into her 70s came up to James with tears in her eyes, explaining how watching The Virginian in the hospital had helped her through a long-term illness as a child. She said his character's moral resolve and quiet strength gave her the will to stay determined through endless medical procedures. Moved to tears himself, James embraced her, telling her that if he'd known how much the show meant to people in such vulnerable times, he would have tried even harder to live up to that ideal. It was moments like that, he later said, which clarified for him that playing the Virginian wasn't just a job. It was a responsibility and an honor that transcended entertainment. During the 1990s, as the Western genre had a brief resurgence in cinema, James explored cameo roles in projects that paid homage to classic Westerns. Though most were independent or smaller productions, these roles offered him a chance to remind audiences that the spirit of the West never truly vanished. In 1991, he was inducted into the Hall of Great Western Performers at the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. That recognition was deeply meaningful to him. In his acceptance speech, he emphasized how Westerns are fundamentally American fables, telling timeless stories of good, evil, courage, and redemption. Yet the public spotlight only captures fragments of a life. In more private spaces, James dealt with the inevitability of aging and the desire for a more peaceful existence. He suffered health setbacks in his later years, some related to lingering effects from childhood polio. Nevertheless, he retained a remarkable vigor well into his 70s and 80s, often surprising fans at conventions when he'd nimbly stand or pose for photos for hours on end. He'd radiate gratitude, as if each handshake and conversation was a cherished reminder that he had not been forgotten. It's worth exploring the complexities surrounding James Drury's financial well-being in those later years. Unlike today, where top TV stars can negotiate multi-million-dollar deals, actors of the classic era often relied on fixed salaries. which, while comfortable, weren't always enough to fund a lavish retirement. Residuals for reruns were minimal under older contracts. Although James had diversified his interests and maintained a comfortable life, there were times when he gave interviews remarking on the inequities of the old studio system. He wasn't bitter, but he believed more recognition and compensation could have helped many actors who, like him, gave their best years to keep iconic shows afloat. In parallel, James got involved in philanthropic efforts. He supported charities focused on child health, perhaps recalling his own brush with polio, and contributed to ranching communities that aimed to preserve the heritage of the American West. He visited schools, sharing not just stories of Hollywood, but also the values he learned on ranches: hard work, respect for the land, and solidarity in times of hardship. Some teachers used his visits as a springboard to talk about American history, the significance of the frontier era, and how pop culture shaped perceptions of that period. James approached these educational efforts with genuine enthusiasm, seeing them as a chance to give back and ensure that the spirit he represented on screen could spark something valuable in future generations. In the early 2000s, numerous tabloids circulated rumors about his health. Each time his name popped up, speculation ran wild. Some suggested he was confined to a wheelchair. Others claimed he had retreated into isolation. By and large, these were exaggerated stories that gleaned a few partial truths, but missed the big picture. Yes, he experienced the normal difficulties of advanced age, but the Virginian was far from broken in spirit. He continued to make appearances, albeit fewer than in his younger days, always met with appreciative applause. Occasionally, he'd show up in a cowboy hat, maybe spin a quick yarn about filming a rowdy saloon brawl scene. He enjoyed connecting with the faithful, devoted fan base that never wavered in their admiration. James Drury passed away on April 6, 2020, only a few days shy of his 86th birthday. Though overshadowed by global events at the time, the news still sent ripples of sadness through the Western fan community and classic television circles. Condolences poured in, from aging fans who'd watched him in real time back in the 60s to younger generations who discovered the Virginian through reruns on cable networks or DVD box sets. Many tributes recalled Drury's unwavering dedication to his craft, his willingness to perform his own stunts, and his earnest attempts to capture the essence of the frontier code. In the days and weeks following his passing, social media and Western-themed forums lit up with personal stories. Folks posted photos of themselves at conventions with James, remembering how he took the time to say a kind word or listen to their stories. Many recalled how meeting him in person felt like meeting the Virginian himself, still strong and decent, still radiating that quiet moral center. It became evident that James Drury's legacy was more than just a role on a TV show. It was an embodiment of certain American ideals: honor, perseverance, a sense of fair play, and a willingness to stand firm when confronted by injustice. From a personal standpoint, James Drury's life had its contradictions. He was a city-born boy who became the embodiment of a Western icon. He was a passionate actor who found his greatest success in a single role, yet he never fully escaped that role's shadow. He faced heartbreak in his private life, but he also enjoyed the camaraderie of a close-knit cast and crew who, by all accounts, genuinely admired him. He worked tirelessly in pursuit of authenticity, whether that meant learning real ranch skills or doing his own stunts in punishing conditions. For those curious about whether James Drury maintained strong friendships from his heyday, the answer is a resounding yes, at least with the survivors of that era. The passing of co-stars like Doug McClure and Lee J. Cobb affected him deeply, reminding him of time's relentless march. In Interviews late in life, James would speak of them with fondness, describing how each contributed to the distinctive energy that made the show beloved. He never failed to mention how fortunate he felt to have worked with such professionals. If there's a lesson in James Drury's life, it's that artistry and authenticity need not be mutually exclusive. In an industry often drawn to spectacle and commercialism, he embodied a role that celebrated quiet integrity. Although the Western genre has receded from center stage, replaced by high-tech blockbusters and sprawling fantasy epics, there remains a longing for the simpler moral landscapes that classic Westerns offered. Drury was one of the last surviving links to that golden era, a man who found his niche and did his utmost to honor it. And that's all for today's video. If you like this video, hit that thumbs up. Let us know your thoughts in the comments section and subscribe so you won't miss out on future uploads. See you next time.